Hi, Kia ora. My name is Misha Peters, and I am the Director of Assurance here at the External Reporting Board. I'm joined today by Bruce McNiven, who has been doing a fantastic job at supporting this project at the XRB, and he is going to be manning all of your questions and comments as we kick off, which will hopefully be a lively debate and discussion. I'm joined by a fabulous array of panelists, so thank you all for offering your time today. We are hoping to keep this as a conversation. I will do a quick round the room just to introduce our panelists. So we do have Cameron Town, who is the director at Silk's Audit, and he is also a member of CAANZ's Trans-Tasman Audit Advisory Committee and a councillor with CAANZ. And he's also on our XRAP panel. So thank you, Cameron. We also have Craig Fisher, who is the chair of our XRAP panel, and he has a long history involvement in this particular project as well as standard setting. So he's a former member of the Auditing Standards Board, and yeah, he'll give us some insights as to his international involvement in the project. We have Nicola Hankinson from the National Technical Director from Baker Tilly Staples Rodway. So thank you, Nicola, for bringing the perspective from that kind of person who's responsible at your firm for helping your auditors comply with our standards, as well as doing your internal reviews. We really value hearing your perspectives around if you think your firm might use this, some of the challenges that you're hearing. Nicola was actually on secondment with us, so we've grabbed her back and said, please come and share your perspectives. So thank you for taking the time. And last but not least, we have Roy Glass from the Audit Quality Group at the Office of the Auditor General. So as we all know, the Auditor General has a laser sharp focus on ensuring high quality audits across the public sector. And we understand that there's up to, or possibly even over 3,500 public sector organisations, and many of these organisations may be less complex. So what is this all about? Well, the XRB is currently consulting on whether we should introduce a new international standard for auditing less complex entities. We know that some auditors are very keen on this, and we know that others may not be so keen. So that's why we've conveyed this panel to get a bit of a debate and conversation going to understand the benefits and possibly some of the risks. Please do put your comments and questions as we go through. We do have this recording, and we will make the recording available afterwards. We are seeking your views and comments on our consultation by the 27th of February. So we're really hoping that today's discussion will give you some ideas and that you can then use that to drop us an email or submit to us to help us make an informed decision as to whether the External Reporting Board should introduce this standard. So without further ado, I'm going to turn to Craig and ask Craig. He's been involved in the international project, which started way back when. So I wanted to ask if you can share your observations around what problem this project was trying to solve, and from your perspective, some of the wins or challenges that you've observed along the way.
Thanks, Misha, and kia ora tātou te whānau. I have a very long history in this space. It's a little bit embarrassing, actually. So I started auditing last century. I was on one of the boards, along with Roy, actually, that used to set the audit ethical and professional standards when it was within the Institute, again, back in last century. And when I started auditing, we had not many pages of auditing standards. And then, goodness me, when was it? 1999, I think. We introduced in New Zealand a set of 30 codified auditing standards and 6 audit guidance statements. These were really clear New Zealand developed auditing standards that picked up on the principles. They made it very clear what you had to do, and then they gave some application guidance. Really well written, really well thought through. So that's 1999. 2005, I went to a meeting in Brussels, which was a meeting about whether New Zealand should look at adopting international standards of auditing, because there was a big global movement that auditing is one of those things which should be pretty similar around the world. So we should really have one set of auditing standards. Made a lot of sense. However, countries were in very different spaces. It's fair to say also that the international auditing standards at that time were not as concisely written as the New Zealand codified auditing standards. And it was a real challenge for us, along with other countries like Australia, to look at them and go, oh, not sure if we want to actually do this, because this might be a giant step backwards. The meeting in Brussels was around kicking off a project on clarifying the international audit standards so that they could actually be internally consistent, more concise, written in a similar format rather than how they were at that time, which was they were written in a style when that one was written, and then next year we'd have a completely new style. So quite a big project, quite a lot of jumping up and down. It was a positive meeting. However, by 2008, New Zealand made a decision under a board that I chaired to introduce international standards of auditing in New Zealand. So we jumped on the global bandwagon at that point. Some good work had been done around clarifying the standards. However, it was still, I have to say, a really hard decision for us, because we were jumping backwards from having something really clear and concise to standards that were 2 to 4 times longer than our existing New Zealand standards at the time, and probably half as clear. So it was a bit of a rat for us to swallow, but we were doing it because, yeah, we had to really do it from an international perspective, flow of funds, all of those good things. There was a real tension, though, in terms of how they were clarified and how they were written. They weren't as explicit in terms of what you had to do and application material. There became a real mix of principles and rules, and that was a big feature. Essentially, the US versus the rest of the world. So if you look at the Commonwealth countries, tend to be principles-based. The US, very rules-based. That's why there's more lawyers in the US. When you try and put those two things together, sometimes they don't fit so well. So unfortunately, our international standards of auditing ended up as a bit of a mix of both principles and rules. The international standards were also supposed to pick up on the increasing complexity of global business, increasing concern over the quality of audit as a safeguard. There was definitely increased regulator input. And if I look at our audit standards now compared to even the audit standards that we introduced back in 2008, one of the main changes has been the input of regulators who have become much more dominant in our professional activity. And, you know, that was in in response to things like Enron, in response to things like the GFC. However, it's fair to say that regulators, if they see something in a standard, tend to look at that as an absolute fact, and that's going to be done in every single instance. Whereas auditors have tended to look at audit standards more on a principles basis of, is this appropriate? Is this material in the situation? Professional judgment applying. So we have had this increasing tension over time. And what that's meant, it's happened, is that we've had a longer and longer set of audit standards. Way back around the turn of the century, there was a big debate around differential auditing. And I know we've got a couple of Australians on the line here, and it was a really hot topic in Australia, where perhaps, you know, auditing was getting harder. Perhaps we should have differential auditing, i.e. simpler auditing standards for simple entities. The problem with that, though, as appealing as it may sound, is, so would you like us to find half the fraud? Where do we go with these simple audit standards? And what that eventually translated into, that perhaps differential auditing was the wrong way to go. Perhaps we should look at the entities being audited. And that's where the whole project around less complex entities and the audit of less complex entities had its nexus, had its genesis, I should say. In 2019, I was in a meeting in Paris on behalf of the XRB, which looked at this whole issue of, do we need a new set of standards for less complex entities? The IAASB had had increasing calls from auditors that the audit standards were getting too tricky, too long, too hard. They were written for multinational complex entities, and yet a lot of the audits were just of simple entities. And their arm was forced in Paris because a number of Nordic countries actually, after getting sick of telling the IASB that they needed to do something about it, they actually wrote some simple standards and said, well, we're going to leave the international sphere and we're just going to use these. And that messaging got quite a lot of interest from other countries going, hey, we're a bit grumpy about this as well. Forced this meeting in Paris in 2019, and that's the result that's given us now the less complex entities audit standard, so developed by the International Board. It's fair to say that even that initial meeting, vigorous debate. I was on the platform. I think we had about 8 or 9 people on the platform, and we probably had at least 8 or 9 different views being espoused on that platform. And there was lots of concerns that another set of auditing standards would increase the audit expectation gap rather than decrease it. It would mean you'd need more training if your firm was going to do both. How would you graduate from one set to another set? Would the public see these as a lesser standard, or would they still get the same level of trust and confidence from these audit standards? So that's the history of it. I've then spent a couple of years getting up at midnight and staying on meetings until 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning as part of one of the working groups on this. And the debates have raged in terms of developing this. I have huge respect for the people on the team that have developed it. They've done a really good job of a hard piece of work of pulling it together. And some things that really appeal to me are it's been developed from a flow of the audit logic principles-based approach. So I think those things are really pragmatic, and most pragmatic auditors will appreciate that. So I think they're really good things. Having said that, not all countries are going to adopt this. That's a challenge. There are still those challenges around expectation gap, training, and the like. So I'm kind of torn, Misha. I've been involved in this since last century, and I'm still torn.
Oh, that's amazing. Thank you, Craig. It sets the scene for, I think, debates across the panel, but also even those debates within our own heads. And it feels like that's the live debate, and the XRB now needs to make a decision. So thank you for that background. Nicola, I wonder if I could pass to you and sort of ask whether you think Baker Tilly Staples Rodway intends to use the ISA for LCE if adopted in New Zealand. And what do you think are some of the challenges in applying the ISAs to your client base?
Yeah, thanks, Misha. So I guess, when you ask, would Baker Tilly Staples Rodway adopt the ISA for LCE standard, we've got to break it down into 2. So Baker Tilly Staples Rodway is part of our international network, and our international network, our global office, sets our audit methodology. They create it for us, and then they go to every member firm and they make sure that we're applying it as has been intended. And so they have already said that until the ISA for LCE standard is adopted globally, they don't think it is appropriate to invest resources to develop an ISA for LCE compliant methodology. So that leaves us in a bit of a situation here in New Zealand, because while we would love to adopt the standard in New Zealand, we could either invest a heck of a lot of domestic resource to creating our own ISA for LCE compliant audit methodology, and then beg our global office to let us use it, because it obviously we're asserting compliance with ISA for LCE rather than the ISAs, and asserting compliance with the ISAs is a current requirement of our global firm. And I imagine this is the case for most internationally networked firms. So probably in the same camp as Craig, like I think that there's a real demand for the standard, particularly in New Zealand, with the Charities Act and the like, requiring audits of kind of smaller, non-complex or less complex entities. And I like the less is more approach. I don't think that the requirements of the ISA for LCE standard are any less. I don't think it would result in us finding half of the fraud, for example. I think, an audit is an audit at the end of the day, but I think, it's significantly streamlined. Being able to pick up one standard versus 36 is quite appealing. But But yeah, there is a bit of a problem posed by the fact that a lot of countries, including our next door neighbours in Australia, have said we're not getting on board that bus. So yeah, that's where we're at, with one of those question marks at the moment.
It's really useful. So, I mean, I sort of see this as the chicken or the egg, which one goes first? Do the firms go first or do the standard setters go first? And it's a tricky balance because we're also in that space of sort of going, should we introduce the standard? But is anyone going to use it? And if we don't introduce it, well, then there's no impetus. So it's sort of which one goes first, the chicken or the egg?
Yeah, absolutely.
I wonder if I can just follow up and say, how do you think that if you were to introduce the ISO for LCE will impact the training and development of the auditors at Baker Tilly Staples Rodway?
Yeah, good question. Like, I haven't done a line-by-line analysis of the requirements, but I had a breakfast with a colleague this morning, and she said, "Oh, what are the estimates requirements like in the, have they made any, have they made that any easier?" And so I went and had a look at the estimates requirements. No, they're the same. So I think, actually the training for our staff, I don't think it would change a big in a big way. I think, the how, the what is still very much aligned. Maybe we'd drop out some of the paragraph referencing, but actually that's not a big focus of our training at the moment anyway. So yeah, I don't think at this stage with the ISA for LCE in its current state would lead to a different way of auditing. It would, I think just mean it's a bit more streamlined in terms of documentation.
Well, great. I'm keeping the panelists on their toes. So I'm throwing questions out of order at them, but I might jump back to Roy and sort of with that sort of overview from the firm's perspective. In the public sector, we understand that the Auditor General is sort of really interested in applying the standard in the New Zealand context. So I wondered if you can tell us a little bit more about why and what do you see as the biggest advantages or benefits of the standard in the public sector?
Sure, Amisha. Yeah, we don't suffer from the same constraints as the firms, international firms do, because we're just domiciled in New Zealand. Probably the Auditor General audits a diminishing number of audits each year, but we're currently have to carry out financial audits of about 3,300 entities every year. And of that 3,300, possibly 3,000 are less complex. And so the appeal of having one standard that applies to a bunch of small entities, some of them are in particular sectors, makes there's a lot of appeal there. Just by way of background, we've always understood the ISIS to be scalable, and we would have loved to have been able to scale those back to the entities that we audit, but the resourcing to do that is actually quite significant, and we just haven't done it for because of the resourcing implications of that. So we were delighted when the IAASB announced that they were going to do something in the less complex entities space, and that's probably, and we've been very encouraging of that in our submission to the IAASB, and in the way I guess it's just their initiative hasn't driven us. We've always felt that there is a need for us to have a more scalable sort of, if you like, set of standards that influence the way we audit some of these entities. And I think flowing on from that, let's say that it is adopted. Well, if it's not adopted in New Zealand, we might just use it anyhow, and make it into an Auditor General's auditing standard. And the hope would be, and we haven't sort of talked about this too much, but I think we would be wanting to work with our auditors in the various sectors, and work together to develop a if you like, an audit program that flows on, that meets the requirements of the LCE standard, and that would give us enormous sort of confidence, because the LCE standard, I don't think that IAASB doesn't go into things lightly and just says, oh, we'll pull bits from this bit and the other, and that makes up a reasonable sort of set of standards for less complex entities. They're not those sort of people. They go into things really deep, and so to have the confidence to draw on that and then work with our auditors in developing, if you like, some audit programs would be that would save a lot of reinventing of wheels, would probably save some of the angst that's caused when our QA people come out and say, I don't like your auditing program. Well, if we've had a hand in the first place, well that goes away. Yeah, so there's not too many negatives in it for us. I think we're really for it.
No, thank you, Roy. So I see the questions come out, and it sort of might be something that we can all just ponder and then think about as we move through the conversation. But this is a question we get asked all the time. So this is a smaller standard. We're all talking about these 38 standards, this great big fat book, and now suddenly we've got a standard and it's like this. So what's missing? What's not there? What's been removed? How can you translate that great big book into this sort of streamlined standard? And I think, you know, Craig's alluded to it. He was up all night from 12 to 3 a.m. for multiple years to go through a very, very, very robust process to ensure that the relevant requirements for less complex entities is carried forward, so that we don't have a question around the reasonable level of assurance that the engagement provides at the end. It's not a lesser product. It's not a lower level of trust or confidence, but it's just that well, number one, all of that application material is not there. So that's a significant chunk that's not in the standard. And then it's taken only those requirements that are relevant. Those that are not relevant do not feature. But yeah, please, Craig, jump in.
If I can add in, I guess the way that I think about it is how the international standards of auditing are developed versus how the less complex entities have been developed. International standards of auditing have been developed trying to contemplate all of the complex entities that they will need to cover. So they are written almost from a point of view of what's the most complex. Let's make sure that we capture that. Less complex entities has been written from a point of view of what's the fundamental principle of auditing here for something relatively straightforward. So, and there's been a call to the IASB for quite some years to change their approach to developing standards and drafting standards, that why don't you just start from a principles basis and then add extra on if an entity is complex and therefore it needs that. But they've taken the approach of, no, we can't do that. And largely because of regulator push, that no, it has to be all in there. So it's quite a conceptual drafting different way that has actually got us to the different result. But I completely concur with you, Misha, in terms of the fundamental principles underlying are essentially the same. And you're right, some very hard thinking went into that.
Thank you. That answers it much better than what I did. So I appreciate that, Craig. Cameron, I wonder if I could pass to you as sort of tell us about some of the challenges that you've experienced with applying the ISAs, the big book, and whether you think the ISA for LCE will assist you to undertake your audits.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really good question. I'm probably a little bit on the fence. I think the new LCE standard proposes scalability. What does that, and I think every practitioner wants to know that. What does it actually look like when I'm sitting there next to a client talking through the audit risks, the audit planning, documentation side? You know, what does it look like in practice? And I think, you know, that's the key question everyone will want to know is, what does it look like actually in practice? And I think Craig's right. You know, we've got to have a strong principle-based standard, and I think the LCE standard it has got some of those core fundamentals we need for audit quality. And I think, you know, audit quality is in the headlines all the time, and I think we need to, if we're introducing a new standard, we've got to maintain that audit quality. or it will just diminish public's confidence in what we're producing. But then there will be an educational piece to it as well. And I think, if you mirror it to the review engagement standard, that's one complete standard. But have we pushed that enough in New Zealand as a product, or as an alternate assurance engagement? So will it become like a review engagement standard where it's there, but it's not used as frequently? Or what sort of education push do we need to have with, say, the charity sector? We've got the incorporated societies, which is a big sector in New Zealand, coming on with all these new standards. So how are their audits going to look in that space? So I think there's going to be a lot of challenges. We've talked about software, getting that integrated into software. But whilst there's challenges, there's also opportunity as well. And Roy brought up a great point: is if the Auditor General's Office does adopt it, maybe something like the school sector would be, where there's 2,500 schools. Could this be a pilot program to see what works and what doesn't work? So, it's something that's needed in New Zealand. We've got a lot of SME entities in New Zealand. As a group audit complex, there's been big debates around the world around whether group audits are complex. Yes, in some cases they are. In some charity spaces, they've got subsidiaries in groups, but are not complex. So there's lots of challenges and opportunities as well on both counts.
That's a really great point. So I can sort of see you're on the fence. So my next question was going to be, do you think you would use it? But maybe it's too early to tell.
I certainly think it would be easier for training of staff to have one audit or one sweep of standards, but it has to be supported by the appropriate resources. There's a lot more AI tools coming into the market which are helping with audit efficiency, but it's never going to replace auditor judgment, the way that we train our new staff. So that educational piece starts, at school, at university, and right through our professional development. So, I think we would definitely give it a try. And also, what does our professional body think of it? What resources are we going to provide our practitioners to implement it? That's really important.
Those are some really, really great ideas. I've made some notes of those, so thank you for that. I think we've sort of spoken about some of the pros, some of the opportunities, some of the risks. I guess a key one that some have alluded to is that there are already jurisdictions who have said they are not going to adopt the standard. So the likes of Australia, our like-minded Canadian friends, these are our national standard setters who we often sort of have similar contexts and backgrounds and conversations with. So it's quite a big thing for us to consider that both Australia and Canada have said they will not adopt the standard. Some of the reasons behind that, others have alluded to, which is a little bit of a concern around this perception. How do we manage? How do we mitigate against the risk of people seeing this audit undertaken under the LCE standard as being a lesser product or something that we can't trust as much? How do we manage that risk? I think the Canadian context is also a little bit different because they have a range of different kind of requirements in place. And for many of the very simple or less complex entities, actually the engagement that's undertaken is a compilation engagement. So in their context, it might be that a different product is being used rather than the strong demand for the LCE product in their marketplace. There has been lots of debate about what to do if you're on the, you were less complex and then you become a complex. How does that work? I think that's also been part of the concern. And then there was also some concerns, particularly in Canada, around the reliance on, or the limitations or restrictions that are built into the standard when you are relying on controls or reports from service organizations. But that's not the normal thing that you would expect for a less complex entity. But the Canadians were quite concerned about it because they sort of thought that the restrictions around that and baked into the standard would mean for the few entities that may be less complex, that would really restrict the use in their context. So those are just some of the sort of reasons around why they aren't going ahead. I wonder if I could just pass around and sort of get your reactions to how might New Zealand mitigate against some of these concerns if we were to go ahead and adopt it here. If our Australian counterparts are saying you can't do it, how could we work together to sort of mitigate some of these risks?
Happy to kick off. Oh, you go, Nicola.
Well, I was going to say, I think we just follow Roy's suggestion and potentially do or was it Roy or maybe it was you, Cameron, pilot it for schools? Because I think, a lot of the concerns are theoretical rather than practical. And so you need to road test it. And then, once they see, once they see an audit undertaken using this standard, they might go, wow, that's exactly the quality that we were expecting. There's no corners being cut. That's a really good product still. That might be one way to do it. You need to hold something up and show people and go, look, it's all good. We found all of the fraud, for example, or none of the fraud, but we found that there were great controls in place to, prevent and detect it.
I'm feeling bad now. Not that it's an auditor's role primarily to find fraud. There we go. Just to clarify that fact out there for anyone. Goodness. Hopefully I'm speaking to an audience that understands that. Misha, I think it's really interesting. Actually, I was surprised with Canada and Australia, but then I thought about it a bit more, and actually, to a degree, I think it's irrelevant. And I mean that with no disrespect to both Canada and Australia, both of whom have got very thoughtful professions and have done some really cool stuff. Canada especially has a very different environment of entities being audited, and they've got a lot of other products that are happening that are less than an audit before you actually get to an audit stage. So if I look at the population that this was going to cover, it would be a much lesser sweet spot, I suspect, in Canada compared to New Zealand. And even I haven't looked at the stats for ages. I'm sure an Australian on the line might be able to correct us on this, but I know when I last did, New Zealand had a lot more entities that were required by law to be audited than Australia did. And we had a lot more smaller ones as well, and that's largely due to our charities legislation. So from that perspective, I think it's more about actually looking at our own space and what's going to serve us best with respect rather than looking at the global piece. It's a different debate to the international standards of auditing, because that was a true global debate where you needed for global trade to have a single set of commonly provided standards being used. The entities that are going to be audited in this are not the ones who are involved with global trade, so it takes that completely out of it. I do have more concern, I think, about the training conundrum, but I think that can be worked through. And the example or the suggestion in terms of, a bit of a working group with the OAG sounds fantastic in terms of making that happen for a subset, and schools would be an absolute sitter for that. Roy, I hope you're noting this down. And then the last one being the expectation gap, and that's a conundrum. And, it's an area that ever since I've been involved in standard setting, we've had the challenge of the audit expectation gap. And, we've gone from a few pages of audit standards to, 1,500 or something plus now. And the expectation gap is alive and well still. So, we haven't managed to achieve it. We lengthened the audit report to try and address the expectation gap. Didn't really work. So I think the only thing that's going to help the expectation gap is all parties in the supply chain, and that's standard setter, regulators, practitioners, accountants, everyone involved needs to do their bit in terms of actually helping educate people as to what's being done and what isn't being done.
Hurrah for that, I agree. And we would welcome piloting and working with others as well as CAANZ to sort of develop pilots and training material. I think those are some fantastic ideas around how we could mitigate. Roy, yes.
Can I say something? Yeah, I didn't actually say we'd pilot on schools, but I put but I baited the hook and put it out there, and 3 of you have jumped on it, and I'm thinking, yes, this is good. No, so thanks for that support. The Australians and Canadians, I don't quite know where they come from, but they say, I think broadly, they're sort of suggesting that the users of audit reports may perceive this to be a lower quality of audit. And in reality, that's nonsense, because they are derived from the auditing standards, and the principles are there that will be applied to all audits. And all it does is probably pare away some of the complexities in the existing standards that have no relevance or limited relevance to less complex entities. So I've been through the standard a couple of times now, and there are certain things in there that would sort of, even to me, sort of suggest, wow, this is getting towards possibly a complex entity. For instance, when you have a engagement quality reviewer on the job, that's probably suggestive of complexity. There's some discussion there in the group audit bits that I'm thinking, oh crikey, I wouldn't be bringing that into this regime because that is suggestive of complexity, and there's a couple of other points. But I think we definitely don't want to get ourselves in a position where we say we're going to apply this standard and then find halfway through the audit, we've been a bit over optimistic overly optimistic in assessing this as less complex. So I think there needs to be a fair margin inside those criteria that you say, yeah, this entity or these entities are clearly not complex, and we can use this standard with confidence, knowing probably in 99.9% of occasions that we're not going to have a problem down the track because it suddenly turns into a complex entity. The views of the Australians and Canadians, we've picked up on those, and they're sort of suggesting it's a suggestive of a two-tier type of audit, one with more assurance than another one. The less complex entities being a lesser quality of audit. There's a couple of things to note with that, I feel. First of all, there's a whole bunch of jurisdictions that are actually all in favour of a less complex entity standard to meet a need, and there's clearly a need. And I was looking through some of the submissions on the IAASB exposure draft, and I came across the German auditor. I think they have a separate professional body for auditors, and man, they were saying, you guys, this is completely overblown, what you've done here, and we're going to think hard about even whether we accept this standard, because it's just not. It doesn't relate well to the small entities and less complex entities we have in our country. But so the IAASB's had to fall on a space where effectively nobody's happy, but. Well, that's not quite right, but it's not as though, some countries have said they've applied, seems to a very high standard as to whether they'll apply this or not, and whereas others are more practical. And I kind of feel if I had one criticism of this standard is that the IAASB has actually made this, it's not an ISA, it's an ISA for LCEs, and we're required to include in the audit report that this audit has been carried out in accordance with ISA for LCEs, whereas in fact it's identical assurance to full ISA, and I feel that they've actually, it's a bit of an own goal, I feel. I think they've contributed to the perhaps perception that this is a less quality of audit by putting that requirement in there. And fortunately, from an Auditor General's point of view, we refer to the Auditor General standards, so it'll be in as part of that body of standards that we use, and we won't be referring to the ISA for LCE. It'll be in our background notes saying this is what consists or makes up the general auditing standards, but we won't be saying that in the audit report that we've applied this standard, because we've got a bunch of other standards that we also auditors are required to comply with. Yep, so there's my little rant on that bit. So
I like the own goal analogy. Thank you, Roy. Some interesting questions coming through, and I think it might just be worth pausing. So one of the questions coming through is, how is the audit of statement of service performance envisaged to be covered by this? It's a very, very valid question, and we've spent a lot of time at the XRB contemplating this, because we're very much aware that our biggest user pool is likely to be the group where they have a statement of service performance and that needs to be subject to audit. So as part of our consultation, we've actually developed a New Zealand part, which is following a similar kind of robust process, where we've gone through all the requirements in the auditing standard on service performance information, and we've pulled out the relevant, and it follows a very similar principles. But that will enable use of the standard in the New Zealand context. So we've definitely sort of proposed that if we do introduce the standard in New Zealand, it will have an additional New Zealand part to cover that. We are very much needing your input on the drafting of that particular part, because that is unique. It's just a New Zealand part. So we need to make sure that that will work for the auditors who are going to be doing the work on the statement of service performance information. So we've dug onto one of the risks, which is our neighbours and others who either are or are not adopting the standards for various things. I think the other thing I wanted to raise is concerns around the timing. This is a little bit complicated, so bear with me as I explain some of the timing challenge here. So globally, they've issued a new standard. And as the world debates and rages around what to do with this new standard, the IAASB is very mindful that they mustn't change the ISA for LCE. There needs to be a period of stability where the standard is there, so everybody can get their heads around what it means, what it looks like, should we adopt it, how do we adopt it, how do we train our people up. So they have purposefully set a period of stability. So what this means is, globally, there's a project to revise the standard on fraud. Good one, Craig. And so the new standard on fraud is going to be issued, and the tweaks and changes that have come through in the fraud standard are not going to be baked into the ISA for LCE during the period of stability. It's not to say it will not be updated. It's just not going to be updated in the near future while we're in that period of stability. It's not as simple as only the period of stability. So if we move forward, we get past the period of stability, the likely time frame is that an international standard will be issued and revised, and then there will be a consultation on how do those changes get reflected in the ISA for LCE. So there is always likely to be a timing difference between the new requirements in the big book and any tweaks and revisions in the small book. So this is something we've spent an enormous amount of time trying to think about as well. I can hand up say the XRB is very worried at suggestions that we should maintain this ahead of the IAASB to combat this problem, because we don't want to change and then have to change again. We don't think that that would be a suitable answer for this market either. But just wanted to pass that sort of conundrum around the group and see if you think the timing issue changes your perceptions around the risks and benefits of this standard.
Yeah, I think it's going to pose issues with training. Are you there?
You're a bit breaking up, Cameron. Don't know if others are struggling to hear.
Am I okay? Yep. Yeah, sorry. Look, I think in terms of having two standards, having the ISAs and LCE standards, it's going to be the interpretation of the staff carrying out the work and making sure that they understand that they're following this particular standard for this audit and this one for this audit. I think there could be some issues with crossover and potentially making sure that the audit file captures that, compliance, with the LCE standard. So I think it could pose some problems. I think there needs to be some sort of mechanism in the standard. Is what if we work through 1 year of the LCE standard and we find a significant deficiency within the standard that we need to adjust for the remaining 2 years? You know, can there be a mechanism to be able to change that? So that would be my concern.
Absolutely.
I had a bit
If
of a
there's a fatal
helicopter
flaw.
think about.
Yeah.
Sorry, a bit of a helicopter think about this one in terms of past changes to audit standards. And, you know, when have they been really fundamental and completely changed the world in terms of auditing? And, you know, I couldn't think of any really. Our audit standard changes have generally been incremental. And in a lot of cases, they have been clarifications around things like documentation or expectation of what you will actually do in certain steps and then document. And I can't help but echo back to the regulator influence in a lot of the changes that have happened to standards. Given that this LCE audit standard for LCEs is principles based, and given that it follows the flow of a traditional audit, I'm struggling to see how a year or 2 years difference on a minor tweak, which I suspect they would actually be fatal or fundamental. And, you know, if it was proven to be wrong, well, then you make the change, don't you? But I don't see this personally as a really big issue.
Thank you, Craig. Very pragmatic as always. Roy.
Yeah, I'm totally in Craig's camp. If there is a fundamental proposition to the way in which we do audits, well, that needs to flow through all of the standards at the time. And like I saw one version of the fraud standard which said something like auditors shouldn't be able to treat documents as genuine unless there's a suggestion otherwise. And I'm thinking, crikey, if that goes through, we're into forensic auditing right from the very start, and that's a completely different sort of audit to what we're doing now. So if that was to come in, for instance, God forbid, then they'd have to change the LCE standard at the same time. Couldn't possibly do it. But other than that, that's a lot of these are tweaks.
So there's been a lot of conversation about fraud, just to confirm that that proposal that was debated is not going through in the fraud standard. So when we do bring that fraud standard in, it is not fundamentally changing the base of audit. So just for the record, we might have to have another panel on fraud. It sounds like today is setting that up for a good conversation. No, but thank you. That is, I guess, where we sort of got to. Was it would be lovely if the timing all aligned, but we don't think that it's fatal flaw that the timing will not align. And we just wanted to sort of check that with the panel and then with our audience as well as part of our consultation.
I'm probably a born optimist as well, and so I don't want to see it as a big challenge, but wouldn't it be great if they could put in some sort of provision to allow early adoption of ISA changes? You know, should they be sensible changes that are put through, which I'm sure they would be, you know, that would reduce any anxiety around that.
And I believe that will be the case, Nicola. So I think the biggest delay will be in the period of stability. That's sort of the ongoing maintenance thing. We'll have to sort of wait and see how that timeline plays out. But the sort of early adoption will be baked in if it's there.
I mean, that's something that could be road tested as part of the schools pilot anyway, hey, Roy?
Right. The other one I think we've sort of touched on is sort of any concerns around the additional costs for what we've called the specialization risk. Is that auditors who are specializing in doing the school audits or the sort of less complex side of town, when they did encounter complexity, would they, if they'd been using the ISA for LCE for a number of years, would they be equipped to be able to identify the complexity and sort of know what to do with it, because they might not then be familiar with the big book. So I just wanted to test that with any of you, if you sort of shared that concern.
Well, just as a point on that, I think the assessment of, is this a less complex entity and is it a less complex entity still, is probably one of the most difficult things about this audit standard of less complex entities. And it's something that there was considerable debate in terms of the International Standard Setting Working Group and the advisory group when they were pulling this together, was should that be hardwired into the standard itself in terms of, almost a checklist approach. If it meets these things, it's in. If it doesn't meet these things, it's out type situation. That was decided, and probably sensibly, that was far too difficult to do from an international context because of the different sizes and different jurisdictional issues that people have. But I do think this is probably the risk that worries me the most about this standard. Is someone happily starting off an audit and getting 3/4 of the way through and then going, oh, actually, I've got this issue here and it's quite complex, and not realizing that, the world has changed and this now actually is not a less complex entity anymore. And then where do you go? And, just the practicality of that discussion with the client, the potential regulators, anyone else, is quite challenging. So that's probably the thing that worries me the most on this. Sorry, Roy, I bumped into you, I think, there.
That's okay. Well, we'll share it out equally. Like I feel auditors have always made decisions about what line of business they want to be in. And I don't think this changes anything, actually. But we have to place faith or trust, or not trust. We actually have to rely on the expertise of our auditors to make decisions about whether they think they're up to the mark of doing and moving into one area or another. And auditors make those decisions all the time now. A standard can't help that. They can talk about professional skepticism and going through the various steps, but at some point you've got to have belief that as professionals we're able to exercise appropriate judgments and do work that's within our competence. Yeah, but the other thing that Craig's touched on is, you certainly don't want to take on an audit that's on the margin and you think, oh, damn, it's too complex, I'm going to have to go back and do it again under the full standards. You just don't want to do that. That seems, so that's something that I guess will be, the auditors will need to be warned about and think about carefully before they start applying this standard, rather than just oh, good, we've got this new standard, I'm going to do it this way. But, yeah.
No, those are lovely points. And I guess the guiding principle that I've sort of listened to at some of these conversations, it absolutely is about the professional making the right call and the judgment. And to guide you make that judgment, your starting point is, if in doubt, you are out. So don't start it if you're on the margin. Let's play in the safe space, and then over time maybe we can see how this thing grows. But if you start on the truly simple, we see how it works there, and then I think people will get more and more comfortable ahead of time understanding the differences. So I just love that simple principle. If in doubt, you're out. Start with that, and then you won't go wrong, I think.
Oops, agree. No, that's a really very good starting point.
Okay. Mindful of time, I think we are sort of running to the last 5 minutes of our panel discussion. It's gone by very quickly, but I sort of thought maybe we could just go around the room one more time, having listened to all of the debate. Do you think that weighing up the potential costs and benefits, should the XRB proceed to adopt the ISIF LCE in New Zealand? Might go to you first, Roy, because I don't think you'll have changed your mind.
No, that's one of my problems. Once I get an idea in my head, it's no shifting it. So that's not very, that's the completely wrong thing, wrong approach for being a good auditor. But I guess what's happened is by IAASB releasing this standard, it's actually released the journey, the issue out of the bottle, and there's no putting it back in. So even if people didn't think that their ISAs were scalable and all the rest of it, and would do the full thing, this thing has told us that, oh no, there is another way of doing audits, and here it is. And that fills a need. There's clearly a need for this, and it's long overdue. So I think we need to give it a go, and I feel very comfortable with what's happened here, actually. So
I'll probably go next if I can, Amisha, just because I literally just written down those words. I think we should give it a go. And then Roy said it. I think New Zealand does have a long, long history of leading the way, with accrual accounting and performance reporting and, the tier 3 and 4 charity standards. And I think this is probably another example, like you say, Roy, the genie's out of the bottle and who's going to give it a go. And it looks like New Zealand is first up at the bat, really. So be great to see how it rolls out on the school audits. I think, like Cameron and us at Baker Tilly, Staples Rodway, we all do school audits. So, like it wouldn't just be Audit New Zealand giving it a go. It'd be a number of the firms as well, which would be, a great way to test it.
Yeah, I think certainly there's huge benefit in giving it a go, I think. Like Nicola said, we led the world in service reporting and auditing assurance. And look, Australia are following us now in terms of service reporting. So I think we're certainly the size of jurisdiction in the world to actually, give it a go. And we could potentially lead the way in terms of the implementation of it. And we've got the SME space with the charity sector and corporate society sector, even in some of our private companies that still get audited for their overseas owners and stuff. I think certainly, the benefits, it's worth a shot.
Worth a shot.
Yeah.
I'd just say that, make no mistake, the IAASB has been forced into this situation. Countries like New Zealand and Australia and Canada have been on them for the last 20 years saying, hey guys, you need to do your audit standards better because, while we've all agreed to adopt them, they're still not very clear, they're still not very consistent, they're still not concise. Come on, surely we can do this better. And I also get it from seeing the other side of that equation in terms of having to balance different jurisdictions and different countries and different languages and cultural customs and all the rest of it, that it's a very, very hard job that they've got. With all of that and being very selfish and thinking about the New Zealand situation, I think I'm coming to the conclusion that, yep, we should give this a go. It is pragmatic. It is principles-based. Those two things I think are exceptionally important. I really like, and then Clive McKeag made in the comments there a question around training. I actually think that training students with this would result in a better audit training because it's actually training them on the concept of auditing and principles. It's auditing 101, not you have to document this because some inane regulator somewhere in the world has got to be in their bonnet about them having to document that particular item. So with all of that, I think it's useful. We also need to remember that New Zealand is a very small a country of very small entities. I do remember going to a debate once internationally, and there was a debate about SMEs. And when I found the American definition of SMEs, it took out 3/4 of the New Zealand Stock Exchange. So that sort of put things in context for me. We deal with micro entities in a lot of cases. So if it's something like this could be more appropriate, jolly good.
Excellent. Thank you all. I think round of applause to our panelists. It's been a fantastic conversation. If you are of the mind that you would like to give it a go, we would love to hear from you. If you are concerned and would like to not give it a go, we also need to hear from you. So Bruce has dropped the details of how to respond to us in the chat. Please do think about responding to us. We are seeking feedback by the 27th. So you've got a couple more days to put your thinking caps on and let us know what you think. But on behalf of the XRB, I would truly like to thank our panelists, and we look forward to meeting again soon. Thank you all. Have a good day.